You are autumn now, the leaves are brown, orange from the spring.
The reason you're here is because you understand how important arts and culture are, right? The reason this whole thing is going on. It's amazing, right? I always think, I've been working with Richard for 12 years now, and I find it really interesting as I kind of go places and do things and do other things, how much it kind of has become part of the vernacular. I cannot tell you that there probably were maybe 1 or 2 places in the world 12 years ago where the Economic Development Agency would have done something like this. And the fact that it's happening now, I think, says a lot about how places are really understanding the power of culture and what that really means. And so I think that that's a tremendous credit, not to us, but to them and to people who are saying, no, this really matters. We care about our cities. Right? The idea of the soul of the city is tremendously powerful, right? And it says, there's a whole lot of things going on. And so I do think it's important to kind of recognize that and say, hey, look at what's going on. What I will say, I have a whole page of notes. There they all are. But what I think a little bit, just to talk, I want to talk a little bit about kind of arts and culture and, kind of why it's so important and how it matters. And also why, how do I figure out how to put this? How it not to do it, or not to do it all the way. I guess let me put it that way, in terms of understanding the value. I like to point out, I said the Martin Prosperity Institute really works globally. We work around the world. A month ago, not even a month ago, 3 weeks ago, I just came back from 10 days in India, where I'm working to build a global, or a national research network across India. I'm going back for 5 weeks in September to continue that process. We're starting to do work in China. We're doing work going to be in Portugal in a few weeks, actually do something in Southern Europe. So we're working all around. But we also are residents of Toronto. Right? And so it's important, as being somebody who lives in the center of the universe, that we also do try to help the center of the universe out as much as we can. Which does not include recalls. But unfortunately, we can't do that. It's not allowed. I don't get it. But it is, I think, so we have done some of the things we have done in Toronto, and one of the things that I actually do like to point out was that 2.5 years ago, when he was running for mayor, the man who was, well, what do you think about this? But the chief campaign manager for Rob Ford said the best thing to do with arts and culture funding in the city of Toronto is set it to 0. This was the man's campaign manager. Okay, now he won. I still don't know how, but that's another issue. But he won. The votes were clear. He won. He became mayor. I have now seen him at events and in places bragging about the fact that initially it was that arts and culture funding in Toronto had not been cut. He would brag about that. And now he actually brags about the fact that arts and culture funding has been increased. This coming from the man who wanted to stop the gravy train. Now, I used to think that had something to do with the report that I worked on with a whole lot of people, with Karen Kane, head of the ballet, with Robert Foster, who's a very strong supporter of the arts and a very high net worth individual, with a whole bunch of other people, something called Creative Capital Gains, where we worked with arts and culture, and we said, look, arts and culture really matters to the economy of Toronto, and let us tell you why. Let us show you the value and how that value adds up, right? And I always, whenever I talk about it, I'm always really clear. Understand, when we were working on that document, we were writing it for one person and one person only, the occupant of the mayor's office in the city of Toronto. Right? We weren't writing it for the arts and culture community. They already understood this. They, in fact, I get artists who hit me, literally, physically sometimes, mentally often. What do you mean you're putting economic value on arts and culture? How can you dare do that? Don't you know it's beyond value? Right? This is art we're talking about. It's important stuff. It doesn't need to be, you demean it by giving it economic value. I'm like, well, yeah, but that argument didn't work with Rob Ford, did it? Right? So I used to think it was our report. Now I think it might just been the crack. But in any case, arts and culture funding has increased. So we're happy about that. But as I said, I include it with a bit of a warning because, as I said, the purpose there, and a whole lot of, the work that I've done with Richard and what we've done over the past 12 years has been very much about, hey, recognize, right, this stuff is really important. It matters to cities. It matters to cities for a whole lot of reasons. One of them is economic. One of them is about attracting, it's convention and visitors bureaus. It's attracting people, it's bringing money in that way. It's bringing money in because arts and culture help lead to other kinds of innovation, which leads to increased wages, increased productivity, all kinds of other things. It's not the only value. We've never said it's the only value. But it's an important one, and it's one that when other arguments don't work, that argument can, right? And so it's important to kind of, load up with as many arguments as you can in terms of really talking about this stuff and why it really matters. So I think it's important to understand that you can't shy away from economic development agencies wanting to talk about arts and culture and also talking about economic development, because this is good, right? It doesn't demean necessarily what's going on. It doesn't devalue the other values of the arts, the social value, the artistic value, the cultural value of what gets generated. But it does say, hey, recognize that some of these other values are in place, and it's important to keep that in mind. And so I always, like I said, every time I was just at an event in Ottawa last week with the Canada Council for the Arts. Once a year, they bring in the heads of all of the provincial and territorial arts councils. So it was the heads of all of the arts councils from all across Canada for a roundtable meeting, and they asked me to come and talk about some of this stuff. And it was great, and we had a really great conversation, and it was really interesting to hear some of the challenges that the different arts councils are facing and the way they're facing them and what they're doing. And you got to hear from Ontario, but you also got to hear from Prince Edward Island and Nunavut. Right? So to hear the things that they're doing and what their arts councils are doing. But the thing that I told them is the thing that I often say. I often kind of start off when I'm talking to any kind of arts group or anybody who's kind of aware. I always feel like I have to apologize at first. Because I'm like, well, yeah, we did say there was some economic value and this was important, and yes, we actually believe that, but we also said a lot of other things too that didn't necessarily get included, right? So many times the work has been, I can't say that the number of kind of councillors and mayors and governors and others that I've met with have been like, oh yeah, you work with that Florida guy. Yeah, I read the book. Well, okay, I read a synopsis that somebody wrote for me. And we get it. We understand. This is amazing stuff. We're going to put in some parks and a bike path, and we're going to get a Starbucks here, and we're going to get us some gay people, and it's going to fix our economy. And I'm like, Mayor Ford, you're on crack, aren't you? No. Right? So I'm like, no, that's not what we said. But that's what it got shorthanded into, right? And so very much when we said arts and culture matter, when times were good and money was flowing, right? And you're actually still in this boat right now, right? In Calgary, where it's like, oh, there's money. Yeah, let's invest it. Let's spend it on. Oh, arts and culture. Yeah, that's good. It's good for the economy, right? Florida wrote this book. I read it. I read the synopsis of it. It's good stuff. We're going to spend money on arts and culture, right? We have a great progressive mayor that everybody loves. I'll trade you, really, anything, any takers. He's coming to Toronto next week. We can send Rob Ford back. But anyway, but the whole idea of when times are good, it was easy, we have an argument that says arts and culture matters and this is wonderful. When times got tough, when it got a little bit harder, it was this way in Toronto, it's been literally this way around the world. Councils and mayors and everybody else came back and said, you know what, we believed you. When you said arts and culture matter and they're really important for the economy and we funded you and we said that was great. We'd like some proof now. People were like, oh, proof? I don't have proof. I got this good book by Richard Florida, but I don't have any proof, right? And so it became a bit of a trap because people easily said, hey, we can spend on arts and culture because it's good for the economy and we just kind of all believe it. But then when times are hard, they still believe it. They're still willing to make the investment, right? And they still use that kind of language. We're still willing to invest in these things and spend money on these things, but we actually want to know that it works. So we're working on it. We have been working on it. We're working on a lot of different people. There's a lot of other people out there that are working on this same question, saying how do you actually come up with measures? How do you actually come up with ways of evaluating? We're working with Artscape, which is a really interesting creative place-making organization in Toronto that does all kinds of cool stuff to create spaces for artists, both live and work spaces that are affordable. They've been doing so for, I think, 25 years now or something. amazing stuff, but trying to develop measures and trying to understand that. But it's really interesting, and it's something to watch for. You guys are still in the early stages of it where there's money, right? We want to spend it. Let's spend the money on arts and culture. And that's great. And everybody you get wonderful things and cool stuff comes out of it. But eventually they'll say, hey, wait a minute, you said it was good for the economy. Where's the proof? Right? So it's just something I always say to kind of watch out for. So the other thing to think about, and I think to tie kind of all of this arts and culture and why it's so important, what's going on with the topic for this evening, right? And really thinking about kind of festivals and street arts and what's going on. One of the things that I find that's phenomenally interesting that doesn't really get talked about all that much, and I really wish would get talked about more, and it's a huge issue in Toronto because of our huge immigrant base, but really everywhere. And that is when you say arts and culture, what do you really mean? Whose culture are you talking about? I mean, I have met and talked with a lot of First Nations people who will tell you something very different about what culture means and how you define culture and how you think about culture and what you should spend and invest in and preserve and what does that take. But when you really say, hey, we want to support these things, what are you really doing? What are you really talking about? Whose culture is it? Who's defining it? Who's figuring out what's culture and what's not? Because that's incredibly important. Part of why Toronto has the mayor we have is because the inner suburbs of Toronto all voted for him overwhelmingly. They are significantly immigrant locations, but it was people who felt ignored by the city. When David Miller was mayor of City of Toronto, we focused on the old City of Toronto, on downtown. And the people in the suburbs said, hey, what about us? We have culture too. We have things there are some amazing things going on in immigrant communities all throughout Canada that are not talked about, that are not given any attention, that are not necessarily, right? I always love, one of the things that I keep coming back to Toronto because it's what I know the best, but one of the things I love about Toronto is the summers. And the reason I love Toronto in the summers so much is because all of the boring, middle-aged, white people banker guys all go to their cottages in the Muskokas. And they leave the city to the brown and yellow people. And the brown and yellow people take over and throw a hell of a party. It's great. It is wonderful. You have Caravana. You have all of these amazing things that are happening in the city, right, that are not the traditional, right? You have, the gay pride, which is tremendously huge, right, which the mayor always has to go to the cottage for some reason in Toronto, right, including this year again. But so when it really is, when you talk about culture, what do you mean by culture? Kirk Watson, who's the former mayor of Austin, Texas, and now currently a state senator. I remember talking to Kirk about Austin, right? And said, what is it about Austin? Why is Austin so interesting? Because Austin doesn't have, if you've been to Austin, it's a university town, so there's a lot of things that go with it, but it doesn't have the kind of cultural infrastructure. Right? It has its own. It has 6th Street, which is, live music is phenomenal. There's a lot of things, but the kind of civic, cultural, infrastructural pieces, they're just not there. And so I was asking Kirk, I said, well, what is it about Austin? And he said, no. He said, you have to understand, in Austin, we don't have the SOBs, meaning the Symphony Opera Ballet. No. They have those. But he said, but we don't have the SOBs. He said, but what we do have is the street corner strange. When the dot-com bubble burst, and Austin saw itself potentially falling behind in terms of economic growth and all the things that had happened in Austin that were because of IT and the IT industry and all the tremendous growth that they had and everything that they had going on, everything that Michael Dell was doing and tons of all these other startup companies and all this amazing stuff that was happening in Austin that was based around IT and around biotech. And the city council panicked. They said, oh my God, the dot-com bubble, it's burst. We're going to lose all this growth that we've had, all these amazing things that we've been doing. It's not going to happen anymore. We need a better convention center. We need a bigger airport. We need to be a major league city. Literally, they started going through the litany of things that every other city on the face of the planet has tried and has failed. right? The big ticket silver bullet items that don't work. They were going to do all of them. To their credit, the people of Austin revolted. They said, don't you dare. They started a campaign called Keep Austin Weird. They showed up. I have a bumper sticker. I actually got one of the bumper stickers. Right? The bumper sticker was on every car. They were going to stores, right, and putting bumper stickers on cars, like Disney used to do. They were showing up at every single council meeting, at every single planning meeting, at everything in their Keep Austin Weird t-shirts. And they won. Right? They won that battle. They said, no, we don't have to do the things everything else has done. We are Austin, that is all it took. Population growth, job growth, income growth in Austin, Texas never slowed down. The dot-com bubble came and went. The Great Recession came and went. Austin continues to be an incredibly successful city. And it is just as weird as it has always been. And that is a big part about what makes it successful. And so when it comes to understanding, right, the street corner strange, and understanding what's going on in those locations, it really is about how do you define culture, and whose culture are you defining, and who are you letting define culture, and what does that mean? And are you celebrating all of the cultures? Are you celebrating all of the different things that are going on? Because our message isn't just about amenities. Our message is also about tolerance and inclusion. Right? The 3 T's, right? Yes, it's technology. Yes, it's talented, skilled people, but it's about tolerance, which is really wrong. It's really about inclusion. But 2 T's and an I won't sell as many books. So calling it, it's about inclusion. It's about being an open and inclusive place. And that means things like the festivals and the street affairs and all the things. And these things are, the wonderful thing too, right? The one thing about these that I always find fascinating and is a big part, Mike and I were actually just talking about this today when he picked me up from the airport. I said, one of the key things for me that we still haven't done yet, that's just always on my list. So if I stop traveling all these places and sit down and have a chance to do this, maybe I'll get there. But that is, if you really want to understand the culture of a city and the cultural locations and what's going on, you really have to think not only about the institutions, the kind of permanent things, or the places where people are living and working. Those things are important, and that's really great. But you also have to understand the temporal things. You have to understand the park that Monday through Friday becomes a place where people take their dogs to poop. And on Saturday gets taken over by immigrant families who throw huge parties there. Right? This is what happens in Toronto. It's amazing. Literally, they take their entire kitchen, put it on a wagon, and they go and they set up the kitchen in the park, right? Canadians don't know how to do this, by the way. They feel the only way you can do this is if you have a barbecue on your own deck out back. You can't do it in public space, right? Immigrants know how to use public space. But on Saturday and on Sunday, that location means something very different than it does. The same thing if you're downtown on King Street, when it's during the regular week or the weekend, yes, the shows are there, the theaters are there, but if you're there during TIFF, it's an entirely different thing. The whole city changes during TIFF. But specific locations change at different points in time. And it's important to recognize that as well, that the value of festivals and of the street fairs and of all those things is not only about recognizing the culture and about being inclusive and creating the opportunity to do that, but it's also about doing it for a point in time. That it's saying, you know what, this same location, Montreal is a great example, right? You look at what goes on at Place des Arts, and sometimes it's jazz festival, and sometimes it's comedy festival, and sometimes it's International Fireworks Festival. Same place, but entirely different things, and other things throughout the course of the year as well, right? Sometimes it's where the students were gathering to protest. So understanding those things and how important those things are as well, so that when you talk about arts and culture, it's not just, the SOBs, but it's all of these other things, and that the huge kind of dynamism of what really makes a place interesting and exciting are the fairs and the festivals, and their opportunity to really create something for a period of time that's not going to be there otherwise. So there. Now I should be out of time.